I like the idea of it being retroactive, and I think the word that I would use to describe this is creating strategies, right?
Yeah.
You're giving them the ability to create different strategies, or maybe better strategies to start to, whether it's buffer force, whether it's deal with velocity or deal with force at velocity. And I think that's a very different way to organize exercises in your brain than what a lot of people coming from maybe a conventional gym setting might have. They might not have those tools because maybe what they're working with is like, shout out level one, mobility, stability, strength.
Yeah.
Like you're working within the confines of, all right, can this person move through this range of motion? Can they stabilize this range of motion? And can they load through this range of motion? As opposed to velocity, the way that you look at loading parameters is it's been very eye-opening for me, and that's something I've learned from you, is looking at it in terms of, all right, it's not necessarily, it's not a squat, but how are they through the eccentric phase of hamstring lengthening or the concentric phase of quad shortening, like breaking movements apart in that way and understanding I've heard you describe this, and I'll let you describe it in a better way than I will, but each of these is going to fail in a different way, and there's going to be different benefits from a concentric phase versus an eccentric phase, and we don't necessarily have to pair both of them together. So especially in this setting, that's something that I think is really helpful to understand. Okay, there might be benefits to part of a squat, but squatting might not be the right option for this person. Maybe they need to do a safety bar pin squat because it puts them in position to move concentrically at a maximal load, that they'll never have the opportunity to do that if we put them in just a safety bar squat. So I think that's a really interesting way to start to organize thoughts around exercise selection. And something that I'm hearing from this is that you use the word reactive in a different context, but it is a very reactive process in terms of you deciding and you arranging these exercises, or even you making up these exercises on the spot. I don't know if that's what you do. That's what that's what I do sometimes. But
Same.
it's basically what you're doing is you're creating a tool to fix an issue, right? So this is what's presenting. Let me think of this problem in this context of, all right, do they need to work on the concentric phase? Do they need to work on the eccentric phase? Do they need to work in an isolated scenario where maybe we're learning to stabilize through an isometric? Or is this something that they need to progress in terms of velocity and not force? Which I think is a very different context than a lot of people will think of exercise if they're just confined to a commercial gym setting where it's machines and dumbbells and barbells, because velocity is not really a consideration as we think of that type of progression. Is that once people get to a loading progression, all right, sick, we'll go through a loading progression. Once that fails, then maybe we'll start at the beginning again. We'll make sure we can maintain range of motion, stabilize it, and then we'll go through another loading progression. So I think that just having that understanding that you can think of these in a very different way, and it doesn't have to be a traditional movement that you think of. It doesn't have to be a squat. It doesn't have to be a lunge. You can take the parts of those movements that are the missing quality for that athlete, and you can double down on that, and you might be more effective in being able to load that or progress that in terms of velocity, because you're not going through that full lengthening and shortening cycle of that specific range of motion. You're just picking the portion that they are the most deficient in, or they need to work on the most, and you're able to progress that portion of it.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, right? Is like there'll even be, there'll even be demands of a sport that won't necessarily necessitate us having to go through a compound full range of motion, right? Where it's, if we have 6 to 12 weeks to make someone absolutely stronger, it might be inefficient to try to build lower body power through quote unquote full range of motion squatting. It's not to say that there's not a benefit and that we won't find a way to take quads and hamstrings through a more full range of motion. But like you said, using a compound movement that might inevitably underload or deload our possibilities of, concentric load. Well, it's like, well, no, I'm going to put this person in a position where they can output the most force possible, right? So, I think that's huge. And I think that's really important, where it's like, maybe we'll go split squat for a quote unquote full range of motion, but we'll do a really heavy barbell step up, because where I need that expression of force is at that particular joint angle, and I don't need to become disorganized before, or end up kind of gassing out before I get to that point where I can actually execute or express that amount of force production at that joint angle. So I'd rather a barbell step up and a Bulgarian split squat for a full range of motion. That would be my preference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe a way to compare and contrast these two is that the way that people typically organize a session, I don't know, if they're going off a biomechanical model, like a typical strength progression, might be some sort of warm-up where they're working through increasing range of motion stability. They'll probably do something that is more compound in nature, whether that's externally supported or not, and then move towards more isolation type exercises. Now, in the gym setting that you're working in, it's not very many machines, right? There's probably some machines or like things like cables, ways that you can manipulate the plane in which you're getting a gravitational pull. Great. But outside of that, it's mostly just an open room with a bunch of boxes, maybe some bars, weights, whatever it might be. And the tools that you're looking to use, or the qualities that you're looking to create adaptation in, are a bit different. So I'd say maybe some of the things that are outside of the area of expertise of people that might work in a conventional gym setting, but they're looking to move in towards training for sport, would be things like isometrics, things like plyometrics, things like partial ranges of motion, maybe accommodated resistance. We'll start there. So using those tools in that setting, what's a framework that you look at organizing a session, like exercise selection and exercise order, using more so those qualities as opposed to specific movements?
Yeah, so I think when we start to talk about those qualities, and I think we can start with something like isometrics, because I think, unfortunately for a long time, isometrics have probably been underutilized or just, ill-utilized in program design. And number one, I think, particular yielding isometrics, so isometrics in which we're fighting against gravity, not in a movable object, right? So an example, like a yielding isometric would be like a wall sit's a good example, or a split squat hold, glute bridge hold. Any of those would be yielding isos, 90-degree neutral grip chin up hold, whatever. I think the unfortunate fact is that we just don't hold them for long enough. I've seen programs with 4-second isos or 10-second isos programmed. Now, if it's an overcoming situation, if we're, doing a press into pins, a pull into pins, a mid-thigh pull, maybe all we want is that 0 to 5 second or 0 to 10 second expression of force production, because what we're really tapping into is that like excitatory response, right? We're getting an athlete, trying to maximally shorten muscle fibers at a high velocity. We're trying to produce as much force as possible. Or, in an environment where you have 10 athletes all doing a mid-thigh pull, trying to hit a high score, just trying to get everybody hyped up before the session starts. I think, sure, there's a 10 seconds or less benefit there. That just makes sense, right? But in an environment where we're holding something like a yielding isometric, well, we have two benefits, right? We have this kind of neuromuscular ability to constantly try to decelerate the lengthening of a muscle group as we load it, as we move towards the ground. We're kind of decelerating the lengthening process of that muscle group eccentrically. But in the other half, if we can maintain this position for a long period of time, we do get into the structure, right? We do start to lean on ligaments and tendons and structure to have to improve. Now, in 32-year-old athletes like myself, maybe that's a slow burn progression of actually that improving anything at all. It's not going to say I'm not going to do it. I'm probably not going to have the immediate responses you might have at a very developmental age, right? You get athletes 12, 13, 14, 16 years old, and without even having to necessarily load these movements or load them very heavy, we have this massive benefit to yielding isometrics. It builds a lot of awareness around positions. It builds a lot of eccentric strength. And if held for long enough, we are going to get these structural adaptations, with good recovery, sleep, diet, and whatnot. And it's going to be really important at a young age to build these, more robust athletes that are able to put up with a lot more contact at higher velocities. So, I think we see a lot of benefit in isometrics for that reason. So I would say, in looking at younger athletes, I'll utilize a lot of yielding isometrics early in a workout, and usually in place of a commonly utilized compound movement, right? I work with a lot of young hockey players, 18 years or younger. Honestly, barbell squat technique's pretty dog shit. So am I going to program a lot of barbell squat? No, because I'm going to have to find some way to deload the squat itself or the range of motion to a point where with these kids it's either not exciting or it's just not developing the qualities we need it to develop. So in place of something like a barbell squat, we can easily insert a split squat at 90 degrees or just below parallel with 10% of their body weight for extensive amounts of time, and we're still going to incur the same amount of stress we would otherwise. The nice thing is we only had to get into a good position once. Whereas with a set of barbell squats, to get 60 seconds of work, I might have to get into a good position 8 times.